Tell you a story. I told Miss Shirley Walker Sunday I wasn't going to tell her the story. She's going to have to tune in tonight, and I think she is. So maybe she'll hear it. Sunday, you got a save the date card, and I hope you'll pick up a lot of these and mail them. I put several in my car. I've passed out 2 or 3 already, and so I hope you'll do that. Well, I am an individual that believes in proofreaders and proofreading. I don't mind you telling me when I make a mistake because I know this, I make them. So anyway, I did this. I printed this up and had typed it all up, and I carried it home for Suzanne to look at. She looked at the mock-up and she said, "Hey, that's really good." And I was quite proud. I knew I had double-checked the address, I had double-checked the date, I had double-checked the times, and I had made sure that we had fellowship meal on there. And my wife looked at the first mock-up and she said, "And what's the date? You forgot the date." And I'm thinking, save the date, and then it went friends and family. That's not that smart. So we got a good laugh at it. We both just sat there and laughed. And I thought, well, how stupid can one soul be? And I do know how that is. But nevertheless, I had checked all of that and thought that I had done such a wonderful job. And I had reminds us the fact that, truth be known, we're not perfect. And we do, though, need folks to help us along the way. We often, well, not we, but sometimes folks don't take others helping them very well. And yet, there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, sometimes it's because that's all we come at them with. All we come at them with is criticism. All we come at them with is the idea of, here's what you did wrong. Here's what you did wrong. I'm reminded of a man that's passed away when I was in Dixon, that I knew when he came to the men's business meetings, that he was going to let us have it. And if he didn't have anything to let us have it with, he didn't come. And so one of the elders one day, we were standing talking as they were all coming in, and I said, "We're in trouble." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because he's going to let us have it." "Well, how do you know?" I said, "I just know." And so we sat in the meeting, we walked out, and this elder grabbed me and he said, "Well, you're right, he lets us have it." And I said, "Yeah, he's here. Here." And I thought, that's so sad. And I still think it's sad. But sometimes folks don't want to listen to what we say because that's the attitude we have. We're always criticizing. Some folks don't want to listen because they don't want to be told, "You might be wrong. You might be wrong." Now, there are individuals that will tell us that we might be wrong when they don't realize that they themselves are wrong. And they're not willing to take when we tell them that they're wrong. But then there are a whole lot of other reasons. But I say that to say this. We're all in this together. While Paul would talk about that those that are troubled comfort those that are troubled. That's important. Job's friends came to cheer him up. Barnabas, known as the great son of exhortation, the Hebrew writer reminds us to exhort one another daily. And so sometimes we're going to need correcting because sometimes we're going to mess up. But James says, reminds us in James 5, let him who converts a sinner from the error of the way, let him know that he saves the soul from death and hides a multitude of sins. That's important. Above all things in this life, I've given up on having $1 million. I do have a precious wife, do have a wonderful son. I do have a great daughter-in-law, and I have a fantastic granddaughter. But beyond that, I've given up on the idea of having $1 million. I've given up on winning the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. I've given, and my dad always entered that. I don't know why, but I've given up on certain things like that. But let me tell you, what I don't and what I haven't given up on, and what I don't want to miss is heaven. I want to go, and I hope you do too. And so this evening, if you need to rededicate your life, or or you need to put your Lord and Savior on baptism for the remission of your sins, why don't you do so? On together we stand and sing. Oh, to Jesus I surrender all. To Him I freely give. I will ever love and trust Him in His presence daily live. I surrender all. I surrender all to Thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. Oh, to Jesus I surrender. Lord, I give myself to Thee. Fill me with Thy love and power. Let Thy blessing fall on me. I surrender all. I surrender all to Thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. All right, you ladies can go to class if you so desire. If you don't, go anyway. No, no, that would be so tacky. I know, that would be so tacky. Come right through.
It's okay if I just stand right here during the whole thing.
Sure, he won't bother me. All right, if you turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 11. Jason will help me teach. That's good. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 11. This is a chapter, really, the thought starts in chapter 5 and continues through the first few verses of chapter 6. He talks about in the first couple of verses, about how to treat church members. And then he begins in verse 3 talking about how to treat widows. And then he'll talk about, in verse 17, he'll talk about how to treat the elders. And then he'll talk about, in the 6th chapter, he'll talk about, as he begins it, he'll talk about how to treat your employer-employees, that type of relationship. And so he's in a very practical state here. And he goes through the idea of those who are really widows and those who are
Forgot to check.
15. I don't know what I was thinking when I stopped. I just know Jay well enough to know I just got to watch out. But anyway, so beginning in verse 11, as he's talking about, he kind of bounces back and forth. He talks about real widows. He talks about widows with families, and then widows without families and undeserving widows. He says, with regards to the younger widows, though, he says, but refuse the younger widows. Now, you might say, wait a minute. If we just stop right there, if we just pause right there, you say, refuse the younger widows. The Bible has always talked about, and God, go back to Exodus 22, Deuteronomy 18, if I'm not mistaken, and God has always made sure that the widows were taken care of. And so now you just pause right there and you say, God says don't take care of the widows? No. Go back to verse 9. What does it talk about? It talks about putting them on a roll, right? Putting widows on a roll. We talked a little bit about this last week. How that evidently, and we don't know all this, but there seems to be some credence to this thought that I'm about to give you as you look at the text. And the church was making a roll of widows. And simply put, these were the folks, best we can tell, that were especially helped, I guess would be the best way, by the church. That if you were a widow that had a family, Paul, as we talked about last week, Paul said, let family first be charged. And let family take care of them, and then the church. Well, he gets to the young widows, and he's not saying don't take care of them, but he's saying basically don't put them on the roll where the church is responsible for, say, a periodic stipend from them to the widow. And so then he gives the reason for refusing the younger widows. He says, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry. So when their loyalties have become divided, it's not always true, what I'm fixing to say. I don't think you can make an absolute statement of this. I think anyone would. But the tendency is, and seemingly the tendency was, at least from this text, that a widow that was, say, 60 years of age and older, that she was probably not going to remarry. Now, like I say, that's not 100%. It's not 100% today. We saw something at the nursing home Sunday. Sweet little old man. He sat down and he started talking to the ladies there in the nursing home. And there's one particular lady that he sits with during the service. And when she walked in, because she was late in accordance to when she usually comes in, he got up and went and sat beside her. So I'm not saying that anything's going to happen there, but nevertheless, I asked, Donna said something, and I said, "Did you see that?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I'm glad somebody else did besides me." So I just thought it was cute. I thought it was fun and funny. But like I say, that's not always true. But seemingly, Paul is saying with regards to the church, the younger widows. Now, why are they widows? Husbands passed away. But these younger widows, they may have a divided loyalty. They also have the opportunity to work. They also still have the opportunity to go out and to find help. And so Paul is not saying, I don't think, as we continue to read this and know what else is said in the Bible and other places, can't help widows. But he said, with regards to the church responsibility, let's be careful because they may marry again. And then verse 12, having condemnation because they cast off their first faith. I found it interesting in studying for this. The word first faith is the idea of first pledge. Talking about, of course, their first love, the Lord. And besides, they learned to be idle, wandering about from house to house. Not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. He says, these younger ladies, sometimes they get involved in activities that maybe they shouldn't be involved with. Such activities as he talks about, having idle time. They wander from house to house. And they not only are idle, but they're gossips and they're busybodies. And they're saying things which they shouldn't. Well, we can apply that to anybody. I don't need this. But he's in the context here, he's talking about widows. These younger widows, basically, he's saying they need to get out and get a job. Or they need to get out and get work. They need to get out and support themselves and their family. He says there's a tendency here for them to become individuals that are busybodies and talebearers and gossips, and they don't need to be doing that. Therefore, he says in verse 14, I desire that the younger widows marry bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. And so it almost seems as if he says, hey, go remarry. Go remarry. Have children. Take care of the house from the standpoint of, as was seen with regards to New Testament times. Don't be one that goes about living your life in such a way that people can bring a charge against you. Live your life in such a way that it's good and it's upstanding. It's Christian. For, he says, verse 15, and for, remember, is sort of a transition word. He's trying to say, give you the reason. For some have already turned aside after Satan. So evidently there were some, and there were some in the church. Now remember, this epistle is written by Paul, a preacher, to a preacher, Timothy, with regards to the events and the things that were going on in Ephesus. Go back to the first chapter and look at 3 verses. And so this must have been something that was going on in Ephesus. These widows you had young widows, and what does the church do with them? What's the responsibility of the church? And Paul's trying to lay that out. And he tells them, for some have already turned aside to Satan. So evidently they've had some young widows that have given up on the church. And so Paul is just telling Timothy, you've got some of that already. Then he goes on to say in verse 16, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. The idea of relieve is the idea of help, give assist, give aid to. And do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. So he says, let those that can take care of those that, say, in their family that they have, so that the church can help those that have no one else that can or will help them. Like I say, I don't think with regards to the text, that as we left last week, got to thinking about it, went home and thought about some things that were being said. And I thought, we need to be sure to understand that in none of this, it seems like, to me, that Paul is trying to relieve the church of the duties of helping widows. But he's trying to limit the exposure of the church. Who all do you help? Well, you can't help everybody. So here's who we're going to help. But that's not to say that those in other categories weren't helped. Say the widows that had family, that maybe the family couldn't help them. It seems to me that the other passages of the Bible would dictate that you take care of them. James 1:27, take care of them. And so that in other passages, Galatians 6, Matthew 24 and 25 especially, would dictate the idea of taking care of those that are in need. Anything about widows?
Kind of in this context, could it be that it's talking about their first pledge? Of course, it's got to be Christ.
Yeah.
But that they became widows, and so they said, okay, I'm going to really get into the church. And now they're all like, well, maybe not.
Yeah.
And so the pledge was Christ, and now they're saying, no, wait a minute, I may get married again, or I may that. I think it talks later too about the fall away. So you kind of see the progression there. How it started with very devoted.
I think so. I was reading today a man by the name of Lee, his commentary, L-E-A, his commentary on 1st, 2nd Timothy. He wrote 1st, 2nd Timothy, and the man that was with him wrote Titus. But he made the statement with regards to that, along that line. He said that there must have been, or seems to be to him, a particular ministry that's what we would call it, that the widows, say 60 and above, were given. If you go to Titus 2, it talks about the old women teach the young women and this. And so that would fit exactly what you're saying. And I can see it. I don't know that I can make a firm case for it, but I can see it being a plausible thing.
He said the women over 60 were old women.
No. Steve. Don't get me in trouble more than I already am. Well, yeah, Suzanne's not. Suzanne won't be, but never mind. I'm not telling you. Okay. Suzanne will be 59 in July. Anyway, anything else? All good. Uh-huh. That's a good question. Go ahead. I get back to kind of what I've said. First of all, well, talking about washing feet. Let's use that one for an example. Is it literally washing feet, or is it just the idea of being of service to others? It should be. You could have very easily said so I don't want to take call. Yeah. Specifically. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would say this. I would say that I'm going to let Paul speak for himself. Say, here's what he says. And so, would there be some leniency in, say, the church at Ephesus? The good example, I think you brought up, she's 59 and a half. Meets all of the qualifications. I still believe that there would be a call to help her, but I don't necessarily think that she would be allowed to be put on the roll standpoint of the church. But that doesn't mean, because like I say, you got to tie in Matthew 25, you got to tie in Galatians 6 and James 1 and Exodus 22 and I think I just caught it in my notes. It's not Deuteronomy 18. I said, well, it goes Deuteronomy 24 and Isaiah 1, where it talks about helping widows. And so there has to be some leniency there. But with regards to the charge that was made to putting them on the roll for the church to help, I think they probably followed it fairly strictly.
But when Paul wrote that letter to and all that, they might have just had that one letter. Like he wrote these letters to a church and told them what to do. They didn't have the Bible when he wrote the letter at all. Right?
They would have had Jesus' teachings, yes, sir.
They had Jesus' teachings.
And they would have had
a few letters from Paul.
They could have had James's writings, because it would have probably been before Paul wrote this book. It leaves.
Paul wrote that letter to them. Right?
Yeah, Paul would have written this about 60. Well, 1 Timothy is somewhere after 62 AD, because 62 AD is after the book of Acts. Probably around 63, 64 is what it was. Most people date 1 Timothy 62 to 64. And 2 Timothy and Titus are after that. Usually it's believed 62 to 64, really 1 Timothy and Titus. And then 66 to 68 is 2 Timothy.
Do you have a reason to believe that churches had copies of letters that had been sent to other churches? Maybe I'm asking that question.
They could have. There were what was called circular letters. In other words, they were passed place to place. There weren't as many copies. And that's another thing. It's a great point. The challenge, if you will, that the early church had of knowing exactly, because it could, you came in, you worshiped, it was read. It might have been read several times, but it was read, and then if it was passed down, it was actually like Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, these were circular letters that were passed down. Probably Galatians was too, because it was written to the area of Galatia, so it was probably passed down and it became a circular letter. And so they would have had it, but they would also, this is one of the blessings of Rome being in charge at that time. And that was freedom of movement. In other words, you weren't bound to a place, and they moved more than we give them credit for. They traveled. And so the word spread.
And not just like from here to Centerville. I mean, it was like from here to Kansas City and then on over out to Arizona. And they made this. Or just little bitty. And so, Paul, so we recognize the scriptures as the inspired word of God through these people's hands. But do you wonder if they would have thought this is God talking, or they would have thought this is Paul talking? Paul telling us we respect Paul, we think he's a leader, but would they have?
Well,
they have thought, well, this is gospel.
Yeah.
Take us over to Laodicea and read it over there.
Yes. What is it? To the end of the book? In the function? Yeah. Chapter 4, I'm thinking. But yeah. Steve, your question, I think, is as varied as people. I mean, what you said with regards to did some accept it, some not sure. Why? Because we do the same today.
But
I mean, you could.
They have said, no, this is not Paul, this is God talking to you. They recognize Paul's writings to be the word of God, or what they have thought this is Paul, and he's our leader, and he's the organizer, and he's the main person that interprets what we should be doing and giving us instruction about what to do.
Well, Paul, first of all, Paul often talked about what he had given them was a revelation from God. Second of all, if I can find it, off my head.
So while you're looking for that, I'm thinking in my head, nobody was going, oh, no, this doesn't comply with the letter he sent to the church at, in Laodicea, like Kim just said, and looking for any contradictions, right? They didn't have that much stuff to be worried over. This was happening in real time, right? This is real time.
I've often thought that if enemies would put this now, somebody wrote I could find a contradiction.
It would have been very hard. What I'm looking for is right at the end of the book of Acts. It talks about the signs and wonders which Paul did. So Paul evidently had miraculous ability. So that would have helped confirm what he said. Now, like I say, did everybody believe it? No. Was everybody seeking? No. And there were philosophies. I mean, you still had because if you go through, say, just the New Testament and Paul's writings, you still had those that were arguing over how much of the Jewish law they should accept. You had, by the time John was writing 1 John, you had something that was not new, but had been around for a long time. You had Gnosticism. You look in the book of Colossians, you had Gnosticism rampant at that point in time. You had other philosophies. You still had folks that were still holding to the old ideas of paganism and idolatry and idol worship, all of that. Yeah. So, So what you have is you had people, yes, doubting. I mean, I think you read Paul's writings. There were those that didn't listen to what he said. There are those that walked away. There are those that walked away from Jesus. John 6. would be a good example of those that said, these are hard sayings, and who can follow them, and they walked away. So you had that, but you also had those that listened and those that said, okay, because what you had then too, people that were seeking. Today, we don't seek as much because we think we've already found it, whether it be the TV or the newspaper. I don't have newspapers anymore, internet or the Bible. So you did have those that questioned Paul. Go back and read the book of Acts. There were those that questioned Paul. And if you think about Paul's writings, Paul talks about in 1 Timothy, he talks about these widows that had given up their faith in chapter 5. This was something that was going on in Ephesus. But we read about Ephesus in the book of Acts, where Paul spent 3 years in the city of Ephesus. You also see, not just in Paul's writings, but you see in others that there were those that doubted and those that were unsure of what was going on. And so the questioning of faith is not a new aspect. Accepting faith. So how did they go about proving it? Well, they had, like I say, Paul and others had signs and wonders which they could perform, which were to substantiate, at least in part, what they were saying. But you had those that just didn't listen. And so they tried and they kept teaching. And as they would teach things that were there that were a question. 1 Corinthians. If you read 1 Corinthians from beginning to end, first one of the things you'll notice is in chapter 7. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, I say unto you. Then he goes on. And then if you begin, not every chapter, but if you'll just peruse the rest of 1 Corinthians, one of the things you'll find out is that seemingly there were questions that Paul was answering from the church at Corinth that had been sent to him. And so there was problems. My plans are, unless somebody doesn't want to do this, my plans are, after we finish the study of 1 Timothy, to go to 2 Timothy and then go to the book of Titus. In Titus chapter 1, Paul left Titus in Crete that he might ordain elders in every city. They didn't have elders at that point in time in Crete. And so it was his responsibility then to ordain elders to do the work that needed to be done. Everybody listen now. And so you have that constant ebb and flow that occurred in the church. It does today. We're not new. Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new in the sun. It's twisted different, but it's not new. Anything else?
I wonder if Paul thought of the Holy Spirit flowing through his arm and through his hand and his pencil. Would he have thought what I'm writing is would he have thought it had that much authority when he was doing it at one?
I don't think so.
He wasn't Jesus. Paul ain't Jesus.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Wonderful person, but not Jesus.
I think he just thought he was doing the work of the Lord.
He was interpreting the message, the gospel, as he understood it. And in the end, we're told this is the word of God, and these are. So do we?
But he had to have. Think about this. He had to have an understanding that he was receiving something. And why I say that is this. Go back to 1 Corinthians 15. Moreover, brethren, I write unto you the gospel which also I declare unto you, which also I have received.
Talks about receiving the mysteries.
Ephesians 3.
So this, I give to you understanding to the mysteries that are given to me. Now, look at Paul's life for the first 10 years. I don't know anything
That's right.
He goes off. And about 10 years later, before he shows
Exactly.
Barnabas goes and gets.
Right.
So 10 years he's had a revelation.
That's right. He saw the light. No, I'm sorry. That's
Sorry,
terrible.
road lights.
Yeah, yeah. That's, so what he knew and what he thought, I don't know to an end, but I do believe that he understood he was doing the work of the Lord. But now, did he understand how it all worked?
And how it all, he couldn't, because he didn't have all the pieces.
Right.
Because look at these other.
But he understood inspiration. 1 Corinthians 2, beginning verse 10. He understood that what he was revealing was from God, because he would talk about, this is from God. But did he understand how he received it? I don't know. Off the top of my head, I don't know there's scripture that says so.
We wouldn't even know for sure that Paul ever saw Jesus in person. Saw him on the road.
It's believed that
After
he
the
did.
resurrection, but we don't know if we saw him.
But it's believed that he did.
Never said he did.
Now off the top of my head.
Peter will talk about reading Paul's letter.
Yeah.
So some way or another, Peter.
Yeah. Yeah, they were spread. Yeah. They were spread far and wide. And that's an interesting aspect. They didn't have Xerox. They didn't have photocopy machine. And there wasn't, at that time, well, there were several copies because people made copies. But the abundance of copies came a little bit later. Not much, but a little bit later. But you still had copies being made.
But not like we think they were making copies of the Old Testament. The scribes were. They had rolls of the Torah, and they don't have any evidence that it was that well organized.
You have thousands of copies. But yeah, it took time. Yeah. It took a long time. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
He wrote, as he went on paper.
Sure. I think you're right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I keep coming back to this. They didn't have TV. They didn't have TV. So what did they do? They went to the court square, so to speak, to the gates of the city. They reasoned, they talked, they spent time with people. They didn't exclude. The evenings, what did they do? In the cool of the night, they sat around, they meditated, they talked. So sure, I think you're 100% right. He took it with him. Yeah. And when it got light, they woke up. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Paul is back in chapter 4, talking about despising your not your youth, but devoting yourself to the public reading of scripture, stuff like that is part of the service there. There might have been one copy of those scriptures in town.
Yeah.
Well, if you go to the library and rent it out, I guess you could, it's such a borrow, but if they had this much time during the day to do something like that, but not, they had to count on somebody having to read it. Don't have any actually. That's inconsistent with literature in general.
He's a vote.
Sure, yeah. The synagogue, yeah, better than walking. The synagogue was interesting. The synagogue would be a smaller room, but there would be a bench a lot of times around the edge. Sometimes there would be no bench around the edge, but there would definitely be in every synagogue a bench at the front. And according to historians that I have read, behind the bench there was a box. Usually that box in that synagogue contained at least fragments, if not complete scrolls, of scriptures. Remember when Jesus, one of the first things he did, he went into the synagogue and basically he stood up and read Then he says, this reading has been fulfilled in your ears today. He read out of the book of Isaiah. What did he do? Well, he went, evidently they said, you got scripture reading today. Well, okay. And so he goes up and he gets the box. He opens, he finds the scroll that he wants. There may not have been but one or two. But he finds, and he gets it, and he reads it. He applies it to himself. So yeah, did they have much? Probably not. Probably not. But they would have had a few. And they would have probably been scribal copies. What they're called, scribal copies that have been passed down. And they became family heirlooms. You got to remember too, though, we think about the limit. We think about it in terms of limited writing. There were what was called libraries. Now they weren't the same as our libraries today, but there were libraries in New Testament times, and there were writings in New Testament times. Some.
They were wealthy enough to have a copy and or just like Paul talked about later, his articles and his whatever.
Yeah.
Where you get some of that, maybe he had was able to get some of that stuff and gave copies of that.
Sure. Absolutely. Do I? Yeah, that's right.
They would have all been medium homes at this time, probably.
Yeah, you didn't have church buildings. You had synagogues. You they would have met. Not much. No, they would have met in open areas. But you go back to Acts 2 and Acts 4. They did house to house. So, all kinds of things. The church, the history of the church building, I want to say the church buildings didn't come around. Oh, y'all don't go out and quote me on this. I'm thinking 14th century. Church buildings about. You had other places for that because you had. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, which is interesting.
Catholic churches would be the oldest ones, I think.
Yeah. But we don't have any. We don't really in South Africa. We don't have any spiritual authority. Think about it. Yeah. We don't have to listen to everything he said. Oh, anything else?
I just heard somebody say once that the people with those scraps of letters, whatever, they find Christian life and were saved. Something. Two of the things I've read is people argue about King James should be your official version until 1766 or whatever the year was. A lot of people that live good Christian lives know that. 1698, whatever.
1611.
1611.
Of course, you actually use the 1732 version, the King James version. Today, if you use the King James version, you use the 1732 version. It's been redone 11 times.
King James was.
So
they were all didn't say, oh, y'all won't be able to figure this out, so everybody gets all this money.
no, they were, so to speak, figuring it out. It was, for lack of a better term, but in our terminology today, it was developmental. Now, I wouldn't call it that. I mean, but remember, Jude in Jude 3 says, contend earnestly for the faith, which is once, and the terminology is once and for all delivered. But go back to Matthew 19, where it talks about the things that, well, Matthew 16, the things that you bind, whatsoever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. So the idea there is it was developmental. But the scriptures, we have no excuse now. The scriptures are complete. We have them in a completed form, from the standpoint of a whole Bible. They're quite accessible. You can get them anywhere. You can pay as little as, well, a Bible now will cost you, a cheap one will cost you $10. You can pay, a couple of years ago, I priced a leather Bible, so it's gone up since then. It was $175. And I didn't buy it, by the way. I just priced it. So, but I'm fixing to change because this one's about wore out, but I've got one in my office already. And it's just like it.
And will the Gideon Society still give you a Bible?
Gideon Society will still give you a Bible. Suzanne actually has 2 members of her family that work in the Gideon Society. Their problem is not that they won't give you a Bible. Their problem is finding places that will take, like motels. You don't find too many in motels anymore. The Gideon Society, from what I'm gathering, is spending most of their resources getting Bibles to third world countries and places like that don't have Bibles at all. But they were still in the United States. Yeah, they still meet. They have, I know, where Suzanne's family, I know they have like periodic meetings. They get together and they pass out Bibles. Yeah, and they give Eastern European missions give out Bibles, but it's not Gideon, but it's Eastern. But yeah, Eastern European missions.
I used to know my in the first and second grade.
Yeah. Well, I ran across in moving 2 years ago. I ran across my little New Testament that I had gotten in school. So
Like it was the New Testament plus one book from the Old Testament.
Psalms. Psalms is in the New Testament. Every New Testament you get's got Psalms in it. Of course, now you find, New Testament Psalms and Proverbs in a lot of the New Testament. It's not that it's there's a whole nother reason. Psalms is not in the New Testament, but you know what I mean. Anything else? Jay keeps ringing bells. Or either that or I keep hearing bells. I don't know which. All right, well, we'll start with verse 17 then next week, and we will talk about honoring the elders and spending time honoring the elders. Anything else?